Good to see you.
Hello, can you hear me?
We
We
can.
can hear you.
All right. So my name's Keanu Chan. I'm from Cranbrook, British Columbia, and I'm an innovator. I like things like school, kind of. I like sports, and of course, I love science. So I'm going to be presenting my latest science project. I developed a novel device under the acronym HELIT, which stands for Hemostasis by Expanding Automatic Life-Saving Innovative Technique. So HELIT is a self-expanding balloon, as you can see in this video. It is activated by the mixing of two chemical solutions called polyol and isocyanate. So when these two chemical solutions react, it creates an expanding polyurethane foam, which is what is expanding the balloon in this video. So I tested my device in a wound simulator. So the two solutions would be mixed inside of the balloon would expand and add pressure inside of the wound simulator and reduce and eventually stop the bleeding. Here were my results. So this was my previous project, and this was the results. So you can see that there's a very big difference between without HELIT and with HELIT. But I'm not going to base my results off, well, obviously without HELIT is a lot more, because that's just not scientifically correct. So I put it through a paired t-test, so a statistical analysis test. Now it would tell me if HELIT could do what I wanted it to. And it said that HELIT could significantly reduce the amount and rate of bleeding in my traumatic wound simulator. Also in my previous iterations, I had Sturgicel to enhance coagulation. So it's a clotting agent that would be enveloping the balloon so that while it's expanding, it is simultaneously enhancing coagulation. And shrouded inside of that hemostatic adjunct was the antibiotic powder called tobramycin. Now, tobramycin would reduce the incidence of infection while the balloon was expanding. So once again, another thing to add. Now, in my present project, I wanted to manufacture a viable prototype of my device. So I needed an easy and effective method to separate the polyol and the isocyanate, so the two chemical solutions that actually expand the balloon, a durable and compliant balloon material, ideal shape for the balloon to be inserted into the wound with ease, a quicker rate and acceleration of balloon expansion, the enhanced coagulation, infection suppression, and ease of application. So here are my results for my design to separate the two solutions. Each of the prototypes were assessed for their ability to keep the two solutions separate prior to HELIT activation and to easily combine the two solutions to initiate HELIT expansion. I developed 5 prototypes, as you can see on the screen. Prototype 1 had 2 vials inside of the balloon. One would have polyol, and one would have isocyanate. When you would break the 2 vials, the chemicals would mix and the balloon would expand, adding pressure in the wound. Prototype 2 was relatively the same, but there would only be 1 vial, so you only have to go through the trouble of breaking 1. So in the 1 vial would be polyol, and in the just free inside of the balloon would be the isocyanate. You'd break the 1 vial, the 2 chemical solutions would mix, and the balloon would expand. Prototype 3, there's a disc separator in the middle of the balloon, separating the 2 solutions. When pressure is applied to the balloon, the disc would slip out of place, as you can see in the diagram, and the 2 solutions would mix. Prototype 4, you can't really tell, but there would be a clip separator in the middle of the balloon separating the 2 solutions. You would remove that clip, and the 2 solutions would be able to interact. Prototype 5, the balloon had a center twist to separate the 2 solutions, and a medical grade elastic was holding that twist in place. When the balloon would be pulled apart, the elastic would fall off, the balloon would untwist, and allow for the 2 solutions to mix. So I'll go over my results for each of the different prototypes. Prototypes 1 and 2 required the breakage of 1 or 2 vials. Negative feedback was the inability to verify that both of the vials were adequately broken. so you couldn't tell if the vials were broken and if the chemicals were actually going to mix. There was also the concern that the sharp edges of the vials may puncture the balloon or surrounding tissue. Prototype 3 could not predictably maintain the separation of the two solutions. The disc separator would fall out of place if it was in your pocket, so the two solutions would mix and the balloon would expand even if you didn't want it to. Prototype 4 required the removal of a clip separator. Negative feedback was that extra and difficult step to remove the clip separator, and also the problem that the clip may act as a foreign body. Prototype 5 provided proper separation of the two solutions. When the balloon was pulled, it would easily allow the polyol and the isocyanate to mix and initiate helix expansion. So that's why I went with prototype number 5. For the shape of the balloon schematics were submitted from Nordson Medical. So you can see the different shapes. Option A has that cylindrical shape, B has that shape but also the cones at the end, C is a sphere, and D is an oval. I went with option B due to its elongated shape and its tapered ends, so it'd be quite easy to insert into a wound. Here are my results for a durable and compliant balloon material. I tested two different materials, PET and urethane. I chose them as they are both medical grade, inert, biocompatible, and do not biologically degrade. They are also both strong, lightweight, shatterproof, as well as recyclable. I tested them using a force gauge. So dilating force is dependent on the balloon's inflation pressure, diameter, compliance, and balloon length. So compliance is a measure of how much the balloon will expand beyond its predetermined diameter when a force is applied to it. So that's how I tested it using the force gauge. So I would apply pressure and see how much pressure the balloon will be able to withstand. So you can see this graph just for a quick reference. The compliance is much greater with the urethane balloon, and stiffness is much greater with the PET balloon, which isn't what I need in this situation. So if you look at the camera, I have the different materials. So this is PET. You can see it's a very stiff material. So of course that wouldn't be good to expand. And then here is that urethane material. It's an incredibly stretchy material and it therefore has a greater compliance. So that's why I went with the urethane balloon. So in order to occlude traumatic bleeding blood vessels, the balloon would need to provide a pressure higher than normal systolic blood pressure. So the normal systolic blood pressure is about 120 millimeters of mercury. A high systolic blood pressure is about 200 or 250 millimeters of mercury. The highest ever recorded was about 300 millimeters of mercury. But the urethane balloon was able to provide a pressure of about 400 millimeters of mercury, meaning that it would be able to occlude traumatic bleeding blood vessels. Here are my results from the rate and acceleration of the balloon expansion. So before I was using a 1-to-1 ratio of polyol and isocyanate, so in my previous iteration. Now I wanted to try a 2-to-1 ratio of polyol and isocyanate by bumping up the catalyst, which is polyol. I also put the addition of water as it's supposedly able to increase that cross-linking mechanism with the isocyanate and maybe expand the balloon even quicker. So as you can see in this graph, the rate of expansion was much quicker with the 2-to-1 ratio and, well, compared to the 1-to-1 ratio, but then the addition of water had no effect because it increases that cross-linking mechanism with the isocyanate, but that's not necessarily expanding the balloon any quicker. So of course, I went with the 2-to-1 ratio. Enhanced coagulation. In my present iteration, Surgicel is still the optimum product to be incorporated with my helix device. I know this because in my previous iteration, I tested about 7 different hemostatic adjuncts, and I did a statistical analysis test to see which one performed the best. Now in this case, I couldn't use a paired t-test because that compares 2 sets of data, whereas I had about 7. So I ran it through the ANOVA one-way variance analysis test, and that showed that there was a big difference between them, but it didn't tell me where the difference was. So that's when the post-hoc test came into play, and it showed that Sturgicel was the optimum product, and it still is the optimum product to be incorporated with Helix. Infection suppression. In my previous iterations, I was using an antibiotic powder called tobramycin. In my current iterations, I'm using a silver nanoparticle antibiotic. This is due to its antimicrobial properties, and more importantly, silver nanoparticles can help with antibiotic-resistant infections, so it has a much wider range of infections that it can suppress, especially compared to the tobramycin. And the silver nanoparticle antibiotic is still a powder, meaning that, as you can see here, the Sturgicel, it's hard to tell, but there's a latticework material, so it's kind of like woven cloth. So there's holes inside of the Sturgicel material. So when the balloon would expand, those holes would grow bigger, and a silver nanoparticle antibiotic powder would be able to pass through those holes, allowing so that during Helix expansion, it can also suppress infection. Now, my final results were for the ease of application. So I talked to local paramedics, I showed them a video clip, and they filled out the questionnaire that's in front of you. It's hard to read, so I'll read it out. The questions were as stated: is Helix simple to understand? Is Helix simple to use? And do you think Helix would be useful? After showing them the video clip and filling out the survey, here were their answers. They found that Helix was simple to understand, simple to use, and they thought Helix would be useful. They also thought that Helix is a lot more practical compared to other alternatives that are being used in the field today, and they also found that it was quite inexpensive compared to other alternatives that don't even do as much as my device. It was nice to see the paramedics so enthused about my project, because they're the people that will actually be using my project if it goes to market. This present project was aimed at creating a viable prototype that was easy and effective to use. This is important, as Helix would be deployed in the stressful environment of trauma, and people don't have time to think or do that extra step. The final prototype was manufactured as an expanding urethane balloon shaped as a tapered cylinder. There was a center twist to separate the two solutions, and a medical-grade elastic was holding that twist in place. When the two ends were pulled, the balloon would easily untwist, allowing the two solutions to combine in a 2-to-1 ratio, so the polyol and the isocyanate. Enveloping that balloon is a clotting agent called Sturgicel to enhance coagulation. Enshrouded inside of the Sturgicel and released during Helix expansion is the silver nanoparticle antibiotic. By partnering with design engineers at Nordson Medical, as you can see in the bottom left corner, a viable prototype has been manufactured. So just to recap, bench testing of Helix iterations showed that Helix can significantly reduce the amount and rate of bleeding, enhance coagulation, and reduce the incidence of infection. And like I said, a viable prototype has been manufactured. In the future, I will get a patent and an MDEL approval. I may also develop sizes for the Helix device. Clinical field testing will then be undertaken in an operating room or something like that. What if it was you? What if you looked on the news and it wasn't a different family that was harmed, but instead your family? Every year, about 2 million deaths worldwide occur from blood loss or hemorrhaging. Approximately 700,000 people are injured yearly from major trauma in British Columbia alone. Helix can change those facts and statistics for the better. Helix will save lives. Thank you.
Wow, that was incredible. Did we ask you what grade you're in?
I'm in grade 9.
Can't imagine what you're going to do for the next 3 years of school. But I do have a couple questions. You already answered one of them for me about the looking at different sizes. What type of wound would this work best for?
This would work best probably for a bullet wound. but it could work for multiple wounds. And if you think about a knife wound, of course, you don't want to make that wound any bigger by having something expand in it, but then you would still have that Surgicel to enhance, to like coagulate the wound and also to stop the infection with the silver nanoparticle antibiotic. So it would work in a wide range of different wounds, but it would probably work best in a bullet wound or something like that.
And is there something innate to your invention that stops it from expanding so that it doesn't overexpand and cause more issues with the wound? I mean, does it stop by itself?
Well, when the two chemicals expand, like interact, the polyol and the isocyanate, the polyurethane foam, it doesn't get hard until more the end of the expansion. So it could still potentially harm the wound, which is why I might develop sizes for the Heal It device so that it can do that. So does that answer the question?
Yeah,
great
absolutely.
Question.
I know we're almost out of time, but I did want to say one of the things I loved most about your presentation was the number of iterations of prototypes you tried. And I think that a lot of, especially the very young inventors, think the one first thing they make has got to be the answer to it. And you had at least 5. You showed us 5. You may have had more than that, but it was an excellent demonstration of the importance of the different iterations of an invention until you get to the one that you think works best. I think it's excellent. I know I used up the last couple of minutes, Sherilyn. Did you have anything to ask?
I just had a question of, you've put a survey out and you've had it, you know, people by your side critiquing and helping who are actually going to use this, EMTs. When someone presents, okay, I'm hurt, the EMT comes, they use your innovation, they transport me to the hospital. Is there some type of identification part, or is there, I'll give you an example. My mom, before she passed, had glaucoma. So she had titanium drains in her eyes. And so we carried with her, whenever she went for something else, a card that said, this person has titanium implant in her eyes, to identify to the doctor who might not have been at the first part of the traumatic injury. I'm talking about the handoff. Is there thoughts moving forward to also, when the injured person shows up at the hospital, you know, to transfer, almost like a relay race, I guess, the information that this is what is in the wound, this is what it does, this is how you remove it without further harm. If you have not thought of that, and I'm sure you have, but I'm just, I can see that as being helpful in cross countries or things like that as well. So how do you remove it? How do you know what it is? Might be an avenue also to put some surveys out if you haven't already. Just a thought.
Yeah, I'll certainly, definitely think about that. That's an amazing question. Thank you.
You're amazing. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your time today. That was a well-executed plan and presentation. And come back in January and at the next GIF and tell us
where you are,
how you've done since then and where it's gotten.